Welcome to the Ezra Digital 2021 Education Series. I would now like to turn it over to Steve Bisbee.
Thank you, Mallory. I'm Steve Bisbee, the founder of eOriginal, a leading digital transaction management platform for financial services, now a Wolters Kluwer company. I oversaw the development of unique digital solutions that have replaced paper processes and created business efficiencies for over 750 clients in a multi-asset digital financial ecosystem. The Electronic Signature and Records Association was formed to educate and advocate for the use and acceptance of digital signatures, records, and transactions. I've been on the Ezra board since its inception. I'm here today with my colleague, Margot Tank, a partner of DLA Piper and the U.S. co-chair of the firm's financial services section. She has been helping companies with digital transformation for over 20 years and has advised clients on over 1,000 processes and platforms that enable digital transactions and digital payments, including those in financial services, commercial and retail commerce, and healthcare. Margot is counsel to Ezra and an ex officio member of the board. Margot and I are the co-chairs of Ezra's Digital 2021 Educational Series. Margot?
Thanks, Steve. Ezra members are dedicated to providing, promoting, and participating in Ezra values, which are expertise, leadership, collaboration, accessibility, and technology neutrality. As part of Ezra's educational mission, this is our second annual education series. The intention of the series is to provide insight and practical guidance on the business, technology, and legal implementation issues that arise across a wide spectrum of use cases. Although eSign was enacted over 20 years ago, there's still a learning curve as companies continue to transform their business practices. These issues are of even more critical importance during this continued time of remote work and contactless engagement. We hope that you will find these webinars useful. Steve, I'm going to turn it back to you to introduce our speakers today.
Thank you. I would like to introduce our speakers for today, Josh Gifford-Burley and Larry Torley. One of the oldest and most trusted brands in graphic tablets, Wacom has a rich tradition of developing and producing high-quality drawing tablets and pens used for electronic signatures. As an aside, eOriginal utilized Wacom tablets 2 decades ago to enable the execution of the first fully digital mortgage transactions. Larry Torrey heads Wacom business, sales, and marketing teams in the Americas, specializing in the deployment of cutting-edge digital pen and ink technologies for electronic signatures and biometric signature verification. Larry has over 30 years experience in solution sales and technology development. Larry?
Thank you, Steve. And thanks to Ezra for allowing this opportunity once again. I'm super excited to talk about some different things this year. I've been a part of Ezra for quite a long time and a member of the board for the last 5 years. And we're always looking for what's the future of electronic signature and digital transaction management looks like. And self-sovereign identity and digital ink and digital signature is certainly part of that. So I'm really happy to introduce Josh Gifford-Burley of our team and leader in these concepts, especially around self-sovereign identity. Certainly a subject matter expert, so I will just turn it over to Josh, who's certainly much more equipped. So thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, so hi, I'm Josh. I'm the director of the Ink ecosystem architecture within Wacom software division. And one aspect of my role here at Wacom is to look into emerging technologies and see how we can leverage these technologies along with our own research in the area of digital ink to improve not only our own technology solutions and those of our partners, but also to try and be a force for good in the digital space for the whole community. One of the major areas that I've been researching recently is the area of self-sovereign identity, or SSI. And in this webinar, I'd like to give an introduction into what SSI is and how can we actually apply this along with digital ink technologies to enable the next generation of digital signature and document workflows. So of course, the first big question is what is SSI? And SSI is often referred to as the missing identity layer for the internet. But in reality, it's actually a lot deeper than that. It represents a true paradigm shift in the way that people will think about their digital identity. And this shift is likely to be larger than the shift from text-based interfaces, such as DOS, in graphical interfaces to Windows, even larger than the shift from horses to train or from cars to jet travel. I believe that this technology will actually result in deep structural changes to everything that we do, and fundamentally change the way that we actually think about our digital selves, our identities, and especially about the way that we manage our personal data. The benefits for the individual and also the services that they interact with are so profound and compelling that although this is an emerging technology, the actual kind of adoption of this technology is gathering pace at the moment at an absolutely phenomenal rate. And we, as an organization and companies, need to be ready to understand what that means for us. Before we sort of dive into the SSI world, I first want to take a look at the evolution of identity models that led up to the ideas around SSI. And the first model, and probably the easiest to explain, is the so-called Centralized ID model. This model is familiar to us all. It's the model that's used for our credentials, such as our passports, or our national ID cards, or driving licenses, and so on. And where all of these kind of pieces of ID and credentials are issued to us by governments or centralized service providers. In these systems, you tend to establish your identity by simply registering an account, typically with a username, password, using a website or application. And this is why it's called an account-based identity. In reality, that means that the real you doesn't really exist inside of that system without having an account that's created inside of some centralized point. The real you is given permission to log into a website or a service because the organization is lending you those credentials that represent you with a limited control over that permission. When it comes down to it, the organization that issued the credentials actually own those credentials, and they remain the property of that organization, which means that if you as a user delete the credentials, your ability to access a service is obviously revoked and your digital entity disappears, but all the data about you still belongs to that organization and remains completely outside of your control. That's only kind of one aspect of the problems associated with a centralized ID system. Other problems include things like the burden of remembering and managing all of the different username and passwords for all of the different centralized systems that you interact with. And this obviously leads in turn to issues with people using the same passwords, the same credentials on multiple sites, leading to sort of security breaches. Related to that is the fact that each individual site has its own idea of security and privacy policies. They're completely generally sort of incompatible with one another. And your ID data within inside of these centralized systems is not portable or reusable anywhere. They can only be used with a centralized system that you've actually registered it with. Because you end up with these big databases of centralized user data, you end up with a big honeypot as well for kind of hackers and cybercrime and fraud, because obviously it's a very, very attractive target. You only have to compromise one system and you get this wealth of information. And in fact, the centralized ID model has led to many of the largest data breaches, in recent history. Now, in order to address this problem with credentials being associated in a centralized ID system, a new model called the Federated Identity model was created. And the idea here is pretty simple. You basically insert a service provider in between the user and the organization that provides the identity on behalf of the user. So the user logs into the IDP, and then the IDP shares some basic identity with the service or site that actually uses the IDP to identify the user. And there are a number of ID protocols that were developed to support this approach, such as the Security Assertion Markup Language XAML, which you've probably heard of, or OAuth is another popular one, OpenID Connect. And these have seen great success, so much so, in fact, that single sign-on or SSO is a cornerstone in many of our sort of corporate systems and intranets. And if you look beyond the corporate world, IDPs have also sort of caught on inside of the consumer space under the guise of so-called social login. Things like if you go onto a website, it asks you to log in with your Facebook account, or it asks you to log in with your Twitter account, rather than actually registering an account with that particular site. This is another example of the federated ID. Now, despite all of the work that went into the federated ID since around about 2005, it's still failed to provide an adequate identity layer for the internet, basically for the following reasons. Firstly, that there isn't one identity provider, there's multiple identity providers. I mentioned that you have Facebook, you have Twitter, you have LinkedIn. And what that means is that users still have to have multiple usernames, multiple passwords, and you have that kind of cognitive load of having to remember those usernames and passwords. But in addition to that, not only do you now have to remember your username and password, but you also then need to remember which particular IDP you use to log into which particular site. And the second aspect of this is that because IDPs are designed to interact with many different sites, they tend to fall foul of the idea of lowest common denominator when it comes to security and privacy practices for users' data. And of course, they are also massive hiding pots of user data. They are slightly better protected in a general rule than a centralized ID, but they're still a very attractive hacking target for cybercrime and fraud. It's also true to say that actually these IDP accounts are no more portable than the centralized IDs that they were meant to replace. You know, just because I've got a Facebook login doesn't mean I can go to a site that uses Google login, for example, and expect my login to work. They're completely inoperable. Because of this, and because of the position of IDPs not really being much better than the centralized ID paradigm, they're also not really appropriate for sharing secure data, such as your government ID, your passport, and health information. They're not really an appropriate model for those kind of interactions. So in 2015, a new model was proposed, a new model surfaced, inspired by blockchain technology, called the decentralized model. Now, this model of ID uses a hybrid approach, where connections between peers, so users and services, is peer-to-peer, but the key management is performed in an external system such as FIDO. This model no longer relied on like a centralized ID database or the IDP approach, where you've basically got a centralized database somewhere else, but it's fundamentally decentralized from its outset. Now, this approach accelerated rapidly, and in the process of this spawned a number of other decentralized identity standards, which we'll be talking about today, such as verifiable credentials, or VCs, and decentralized identifiers, or DIDs. The most important difference of this model is that it was no longer account-based, but instead works in a similar way that identity works in the real world, i.e. that's based on identity and a direct relationship between you as the user and the other party as your direct peer. Neither of you control, provide, or own the relationship to the other. It's a mutually agreed connection between the two. And this is true whether the other party is a person, an organization, or indeed a thing. In the peer-to-peer model, neither party has an account with the other. It's this idea of sharing a connection. If you think about it, it's almost like a piece of string with a cup on each end, where each party holds the cup. If one side lets go of the cup, then that connection is broken. But as long as both parties wish to maintain that connection, the connection will persist. Peer-to-peer connections, by their very nature, are inherently decentralized because any peer can connect to any other peer anywhere. Indeed, this is how the internet itself works. So how do we go about turning this concept of peer-to-peer connection into a trusted identity layer? And how does the actual blockchain piece fit into this story? The answer actually lies in public-private key cryptography, which is a mechanism that allows data to be securely exchanged by means of encryption mathematical algorithms based on keys that are held by each party. In the SSI and decentralized model, rather than using the blockchain for cryptocurrency, as you may have heard, it used traditionally, the decentralized ID approach actually uses the blockchain as a centralized public key infrastructure, or DPKI. So, and what this is it provides a decentralized solution for exchanging public keys, as well as storing public keys in a publicly viewable manner such that a party can use those keys to validate digital signatures on digital identity credentials or verifiable credentials. And then peers can exchange these credentials to provide proof of real-world identity or access. And ironically, what this means actually is the best overall analogy for the decentralized model is in fact exactly the same way that we provide ID and credentials to each other in the real world, which is by getting our wallet out, showing the credentials that we've been issued with, like our driving licenses, to somebody who wants to actually verify that we have access or we are who we say we are. The key difference, obviously, with digital identity approach is that we're going to use digital wallets to actually hold these credentials, and the credentials that we exchange are digital by their very nature. The popular term that's sort of come around this decentralized ID, in fact, you've heard me use it several times today already, is this term of self-sovereign identity, or SSI. This is kind of now the standard term that's used to refer to this model. But unfortunately, it's poorly worded, and it's led to two kind of myths that have formed around the concept of SSI. The first of these being that SSI can only be self-asserted identity. That is that, you know, I can only make assertions about myself. But this obviously isn't true, in the same way that I've got a wallet full of ID cards. Just because it's my wallet and the ID cards refer to me, those ID cards aren't issued by me. In the same way that in the digital world, in the SSI world, the digital credentials that I hold can be issued by trusted parties and held inside of my physical wallet. And the second sort of big myth that came up with the idea of self-sovereign identity is that SSI and the technology surrounding it is just for the identification of people. Now, whilst it's true that the SSI model is very much informed by the individual's need for security, privacy, and data control, the same model applies equally to organizations and to things. In fact, it can be applied to anything that needs an identity on an internet or a connected system. And as you'll see later in this presentation, this becomes extremely powerful when we start looking at applying these ideas to digital document workflows. But in order to actually create a functional and a working SSI system, there are 7 key building blocks that you need. They are verifiable credentials, the digital wallet, a credential issuer, a digital agent, which we'll explain in a minute, decentralized identifiers, DIDs, blockchains or a verifiable data registry, and a governance framework. Now, these key pieces fit together to form something called the trust over IP stack, which is this diagram on the right here, which is a 4-layer architectural model for SSI-powered digital trust. And this model is actually currently in the process of being standardized by the Trust Over IP Foundation. The verifiable credentials themselves are a digital equivalent of the physical credentials that we carry in our wallets every day. In the previous slide, the claim that's issued by the claim issuer is correctly referred to as a verifiable credential. And what this means in simple terms is it's actually a block of metadata about a subject, such as an individual. And that data is then digitally signed by a claim issuer, the trusted source, such that a party who wants to actually look at that claim can verify that the claim is issued by a trusted party, that it hasn't been tampered with at any point since it was issued, and that it's referencing the correct subject, i.e. the particular person. A good example of this is a driving license. So a driving license issued by the DMV. The digital equivalent of that would be the DMV issuing a verifiable credential to the user that actually represents their driving license. And then that user could present that digital credential in a digital manner to anybody who wants to validate information within the VC. If you look at the example here, you can see actually that verifiable credentials match or map quite well into the real credentials that we have in the real world. In this example, obviously the driving license. Now, the other key piece that we talk about is the digital wallet. And this is the digital equivalent of a physical wallet you carry around. And it's primarily used for holding both the keys and those verifiable credentials on any modern computing device, such as your smartphone or your laptop. It doesn't have to be on a physical device. Wallets can also be provided to your users in the form of a server-side wallet, hosted as a service, or a sort of custodial wallet, where the user's keys and credentials are stored on behalf of that user. The digital wallets that we use inside of the SSI world are slightly different to digital wallets you may have seen in the past related to cryptocurrencies, in that they tend to implement the open standards to ensure that there is good portability for the verifiable credentials and the other data that is held within the wallet. And secondly, that the digital wallets for SSI work in conjunction with something called a digital agent. And the job of that is a software that handles the connections and credential exchanges, which I'll cover in more depth in a moment. If we take a step back and actually look at credentials, any type of credential, be it digital or physical, needs 3 roles in order to form that trust triangle such that a credential can be accepted. The 3 roles being a credential issuer that provides the proof, the credential, to the claims holder, and then the claims holder can present that claim to the verifier. A good real world example again of this would be that digital version of your driving license. The DMV would issue a digital credential to a driver who can then store that credential inside of their digital wallet. At a later stage, say for example, the driver is requested to prove their age. The verifier can examine the digital signature of a claim that is generated by the user that shows their age. The claim itself can actually be generated by the digital wallet from the digital credential that was issued from the DMV, but only contain the details of the age of the user. Because this is actually a very interesting sub-feature of an FSI system that helps sort of with that data control. Given a claim, so the entire driving license, the ID, the passport, whatever, you can actually generate a subclaim from that as a user. So you can generate your own verifiable credential or presentation that contains just particular fields of that verifiable credential and then present that. And what this means is, if you take the example of that age verification, if I present you with my entire driving license in order to prove my age, for sure, you're able to look at the driving license and say, yep, that's a valid driving license, and I can read your date of birth. But you can also read my home address, you know, any kind of convictions that I've got, the exact status of my license, when it's going to expire. And that's all additional data, very personal data to me. You don't need to know just to verify my age. With SSI, I can just give you the date of birth option, and you can look at that and you can see, okay, well, it's digitally signed. I can tell that Joss created this credential. I can tell that Joss derived this from a credential that was issued by the DMV of type driving license. And therefore, because I trust the DMV as a valid trust issuer, and I can verify that Joss is who he says it is and it's derived from that credential, I can actually be certain the data that I'm being presented is an accurate representation of the data that was issued by the DMV. And that data in that scenario being the date of birth. And from a kind of, if you think about the problems we've had recently with data breaches and personal data sort of being spread everywhere on the internet, that's a very, very powerful aspect of SSI from a user perspective. One of the sort of key differences between digital wallet and physical wallets, obviously, is how they operate. In the physical world, the wallet is directly operated by a person, the owner of the wallet. The owner, me, I take control of adding credentials, those kind of cards and ID cards, to my wallet, and then I take control of issuing them on request to somebody, to a verifier, so they can verify that information. In the case of the digital wallet, software is obviously required to actually operate those functions within the wallet itself. In the SSI world, that software module that controls issuing and interacting with that wallet is referred to as the digital agent. And the digital agent acts as a wrapper around the digital wallet, primarily to ensure that only the person that's actually the subject of the wallet, the person who owns the wallet, is able to interact with the keys and those verifiable credentials and actually use them and present them on request to somebody who wants some kind of proof or truth asserted to them. Another key aspect, or another key concept behind the idea of SSI is the idea of a DID. Now, a DID is a new type of digital address, similar if you think about it like a web address. But a DID allows the details of a subject, i.e., myself, my digital identity, to be resolved by anybody else in a decentralized manner. In essence, what that means is that if I give you my DID, my user DID, you can retrieve the public keys that are associated to my user. And then you can use those public keys in order to verify claims that I create. So I can prove that I control and that I own that ID. That ID represents me in the digital world. These DIDs are normally registered on using distributed ledger technology, like blockchain, for example, but they can actually be stored on any kind of decentralized network. Because of the special format of these DIDs, that's outlined on the right-hand side here, it's actually possible to resolve DIDs across different networks. They are globally unique, globally resolvable, meaning, for example, that just because I have a DID, my ID DID is registered onside the Wacom blockchain, and your DID is registered on, say, the Bitcoin network, that doesn't prevent our agents, our digital agents, from resolving each other's public keys such that we can then create a secure connection between us and begin that exchange of trusted data. Talking about blockchains and verifiable data registries, these serve as a decentralized and cryptographically protected database, acting basically as a source of truth for both the DIDs and the public keys of the DIDs themselves, without actually being subject to a single point of failure. And that's important for two aspects. One, obviously, for resilience, but two, for that idea of trust. It being decentralized and sort of globally resolvable means that you're not trusting the system that I presented you with to assert the public key information. It's just there to be read in a trusted way. And because of the nature of these systems, you can see the history and the propagation of that key. Obviously, the ultimate goal of SSI and SSI infrastructure is to achieve a mutually acceptable level of trust between two parties interacting on the electronic network. So far, all the pieces that I've described deal with the kind of the digital side, the cryptographic trust. But the other aspect of SSI is the aspect of human trust. A governance framework creates a sort of second triangle of trust, which you can see in the lower half of the diagram on the right here. And the idea of the governance framework is really to make the job of a verifier easier by allowing a verifier to check to see whether the issuer of a particular credential is authorized under a particular governance framework that a verifier trusts. Now, the governance frameworks are the secret that allow this SSI and this VC approach to actually scale up to massive global sizes by means of creating these kind of recursive trust triangles. A good example of this in the the real world, it's a digital example, but a pre-SSI example is actually the Visa network, the credit card network. As a kind of storefront or a storefront system, I sort of accept a Visa, and when I come to verify a Visa and verify the credentials associated with the Visa, I verify it against the trust governance that has been created by the Visa network. Now, each card issuer, so say, all the various different banks, they all issue Visa cards, but as the verifier, I only need to trust that it's actually following Visa's governance framework for me to trust that that particular card is valid, rather than having to trust each individual bank issuer individually. So if you think about it, what that means is that actually, as a system, I can trust one thing and know that implicit trust, because of those linked trusts inside of Visa, that issuer can be trusted. And governance frameworks allow SSI VCs to work in exactly the same manner. So they sign up to a particular governance framework, and if I trust that governance framework, then I can see that that particular issuer is bound to that governance framework, then I know that I can trust that without having to actually implicitly trust the overall issuer itself. So that's the concept of a very quick kind of overview of the concept of SSI from the point of view of a user who wants to protect and maintain control of their data. But as I mentioned, the concepts of SSI can actually be applied to any subject. And this becomes particularly interesting when we start to think of document workflow scenarios, where a document can actually become an SSI entity in its own right. And what that means is that you can start to issue credentials and assertions directly to the document, enabling aspects of the document to be verified and aspects of the document workflow to be verified in a completely decentralized manner. To try and explain this concept a bit further, I'd like to briefly introduce the wacom secure signing concept, which is something that we're developing internally at the moment. The purpose of this system is to provide a platform where the authenticity of a document and the signatures within that document can be verified by any system or person independently of the systems that we used for the creation or the storage of the document itself. In fact, we're even actually able to verify the current status of the document just from a printout of the document by harnessing the characteristics of our SSI ecosystem. If you consider the scenario of a doctor issuing a letter for treatment to their patient that needs to be signed by both the doctor and the patient themselves. In our secure signing workflow, an SSI entity, a DID, is created for the doctor, a DID is created for the patient, and a DID is created for the letter. A credential is then issued to the document from the doctor that contains the details of that document, that doctor's signature to the document. Another credential is then generated by the patient, issued to the document, which then details the countersignature from the patient. These two credentials are then used to generate a QR code for each of the particular signatures. And that QR code can be resolved to those verifiable credentials within the system. And what we're doing is we're actually applying that appearance to the document itself. Once that appearance has been applied to the document, the overall system will then generate a final VC, another verifiable credential, that contains the details of the file hash for the original document and optionally a kind of resolvable address for that document. But what this is actually doing is that's completely externalizing the digital signature and the provenance process of the document away from the system. The patient's then able to take the physical hard copy of that document or the digital version of the document to a treatment facility. And that treatment facility is able to use, or their systems are able to use SSI in order to confirm the ID of the patient, and then also retrieve the details of the digital signatures on the document, including the approval workflows. The secure signing system also enables the clinic to retrieve the original certified version of that document, which obviously can then be compared to the hash data that's presented inside of the VC, which is publicly resolvable, in order to confirm and the contents of the document itself. All of this is able to be accessed using the SSI standards, W3C's published standards, and standard SSI protocols. This means that the actual trust layer and the provenance layer for that document exists completely outside of the DMS systems themselves and can be verified by any system independently without having to create specific integrations for a particular system. But that's not the kind of only piece of the story. The real power of the SSI comes into play is that we provide mechanisms that don't only allow you to get the true certified original documents, but they also allow you to resolve the current state of a document retrieved by the verifier. If you think about the scenario where for some reason a document that was issued needed to be revoked or could only be used once, because the details of the document provenance are contained within the VCs, those VCs can be updated, they can be revoked, and this would be immediately shown at any point when a verifier attempts to validate those VCs. Furthermore, this actually enables interesting sort of derived document workflows. If you think about a document that's been signed, and then that document gets amended and signed elsewhere, the second version of that document, when that's created, will have an SSI entry and a VC, which will actually link it back to the first document. So what that means is if you take the first document and go to resolve the VCs of that document, you can actually provide a link saying, by the way, there's a future version of this document available over here, so all through sort of SSI standards. And then you can traverse the links inside of those verifiable credentials to enable you to actually see what the updated version of the document is. and or to find out the document's been revoked or outdated, without all from a printout, all with standards, without having to have any integrations between the systems. And that's all well and good, but there's one more sort of piece to the story that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's, well, how do we actually link these digital ideas, this digital world, into the physical world? In all of the discussions I've gone over so far, we've always said that a digital wallet is stored on or held on a secure device. But how can we actually confirm that the user that is presenting the credentials is actually who they say they are, and not just somebody who's gained access to their phone or logged to their secure computer or whatever? But by the use of our biometric signature technology inside of the secure signing platform, we can ensure at the point that a credential is issued by somebody, or that a credential is requested for presentation, that the current operator of that wallet is the actual person and not just somebody who's gained control of the agent. Our signature technology allows us to capture a handwritten signature using a stylus or like a wacom STU pad, for example. And although when you sign on a digital device, it may just look like a static image, the data that is captured is actually a complete record of pen movement against time, including with Wacom tablets when the pen is above the tablet itself. The FSS format is then used to actually store this pen data along with the metrics for the device that was used to capture the signature in a forensically secure and tamper-proof manner. And in addition to this capture system, we also have an advanced biometric signature verification technology that enables us to determine if a biometric signature that has been captured is a true likeness of another signature, or if it is in fact an attempted imitation of that signature. How we use this in the secure signing platform is that the verification engine, the GSV, is used to validate the signature that's been captured matches the signature that is stored against the user's SSI record within their wallet, inside that digital agent. And what that is doing is that's effectively bridging the gap between the digital world and the physical world, ensuring that the person is actually who they say they are. Now, the use of the handwritten signature is actually also quite significant from the kind of human point of view as well. It's been said that when we sign with both our hand and our mind, and that the act of signing actually really binds the intent of that user into the action that they are performing. It also helps the user get a more tangible sense of an SSI system. I mean, if you think about, I talk about credentials being digitally signed. If you think from a user's perspective, that doesn't really make it's not a very clear communication. But if you think about, I'm agreeing to this, I'm actually signing off on this, that will actually help bridge the concepts between the real world and the digital world of the SSI in a more sort of natural and a more human way. So by exploiting the ideas of self-sovereign technology, the secure signing platform provides 4 key features that benefit all users of the system. As I just said, the biometric signatures provide a way of ensuring that a person attempting to sign a document is not only who they say they are, but also can be applied to authorization workflows to ensure that that person is actually allowed to issue a particular document. This, again, acts as our bridge from the physical world into the SSI platform. The SSI system is used to register the signing event and the associated SSI entries that can then be used, or that can then be resolved using industry standards, so industry standard protocols and systems, enabling anyone to verify the status of a document, the signatures inside of the document, and the users that were part or involved in the signing events of a particular document. Along with those VCs that we issue related to the signing event, a verifiable credential can optionally be created that actually provides the retrieval of the original version of that digital document. For example, if you take the document and store it on a distributed file system like IPFS, I can imagine a scenario where you take a document, encrypt it, and store it on IPFS. That IPFS address could then be added to a credential, could be issued to the document, so that at a later stage, anybody verifying or validating those VCs could retrieve the original version of that document. And finally, one of the most interesting aspects of this entire system is that for the very nature of the way that SSI and verifiable credentials work, means that we actually have a ready-to-go audit trail for the document, the people, and the signatures that can be externally verified every single step of the way. So in summary, as more of these decentralized systems appear, the more customers will expect systems to support these kind of SSI style workflows where they have more control and more power over their identity and their data. So we all really need to plan now of how we can adapt to our systems to actually work with inside these paradigms. SSI is driving this move towards decentralized applications, and it has the power to solve the issue of privacy and identity once and for all by actually providing the internet and connected systems with that missing trust layer. By extending this concept beyond people to include entities, we can create really powerful and secure systems. And by combining those with biometric signature technology, we can actually link the real world in a secure manner into our kind of digital utopia. So I hope that this kind of demonstration has helped show you how these high-level SSI concepts can be adapted and applied to document workflows, and sort of how we can sort of drive towards this new concept of the decentralized web. Here at Wacom, we are continuing to sort of develop our SSI ecosystem to provide support to existing systems in many different workflows. So if you have any questions about this, please contact me. This is a topic that I'd love to hear from you about. But that's all I have to say about SSI. So Larry, I think I'll hand back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joss.
Okay.
There actually is a question or two here.
Okay.
The first one, I'm going to try and summarize it. It says, this SSI system, despite some new features like subclaims, blah, 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 seems like PKI systems we've experienced in the past. And the main failure of PKI was the inability of users to deal with the keys and key management. So how is this different using cloud wallets, and will this just be for the tech savvy?
Well, this is an excellent question. It's one of the topics that I sort of wrangle with a lot. And the first thing about the PKI failures is that, again, primarily you're looking there at a centralized problem, because the key issue is we have these centralized authorities actually issue those keys, and the trust lies with the authority. So the first thing is that SSI relies more on self-issued keys and being able to assert you own those. But yes, when it comes to the actual idea of users actually handling and dealing with these credentials, that is a problem. And primarily it revolves around us as sort of technologists and tech companies to actually build those wallets to help enable these users. What's driving it actually is a lot around, especially in Europe, around the idea that as companies, we have trouble maintaining users' data, holding users' data. And there's actually governments are beginning to generate government-issued digital wallets. So in the early stages, where we are at the moment, this is a very kind of new field. It is currently geared very much towards sort of the tech savvy, but it is gathering pace to the point where they will come, it will become more natural and more common to actually be interacting with SSI systems. A good example, actually, if you think about it, every single person probably on this call currently has a smartphone, On the Apple, we have the Apple Wallet. In principle, that's a digital wallet. And what will happen is that those systems will be extended to support the protocols of SSI. So SSI is a set of standards and a set of standard protocols that are designed to be easy. So once Google add SSI features to their wallet system, Samsung added to theirs, Apple added to theirs, suddenly you've got millions of people that just have an easy click to interface, and the actual kind of the smarts, if you like, go down to the hardware vendors to actually deal with this. But you're right, that is one of the major areas that will slow the adoption of it. But I think, it didn't happen this year, but there were rumors in the developer forums on the Apple side, for example, that they were going to be opening up the Apple Wallet system to actually support SSI this year. It didn't happen this year, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see next year that actually the Apple Wallet system and the Google Wallet system are already open up to actually use these SSI protocols.
Excellent. Thanks, Joss. Next question is sort of a follow-up to that. Realistically, how close are we to a real-world deployment? I think you could really say, okay, this is using this concept, this SSI concept.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, like I say, this is very early days, and when we talk about general deployments to the masses, we're probably sort of 3 to 5 years out. Now, I think that the key piece to that is going to be as I mentioned, I think the key piece is going to be Apple adding it to their wallet system, adding SSI support to their wallet system, and Google adding it to their wallet system. But there's a large number of systems at the moment. They're actually being built with this SSI technology, but they're doing, as we are actually inside of Wacom with one of our other pieces of software, they're actually applying all the SSI principles and all the SSI protocols inside, but then they are being the custodian of the user's wallet. Because the system that I described with SSI, it's like the end game. That's where everybody wants to get to, and that's where we need to have general mass adoption. But at the moment, as we all have these ideas, we have these centralized logins, and I'm not going to be able to go tomorrow and say, okay, now we're SSI enabled everywhere across the thing. So what's happening is we're building these systems and we're building these custodial wallets such that all the pieces are in place, and when the big players sort of switch over, then it will be obvious from a user's perspective. It will just be like, oh, in the same way that it flashes up and says Face ID to log into something, it will just be my wallet instead. But that's kind of mass adoption. That doesn't mean, though, that we can't benefit from SSI now in different systems, especially when we start talking about the idea of being able to trace the history of a particular document, or indeed authenticity and trust between different systems. An example of where SSI is being used today is in the oil industry. So tracking where particular parts that go into the different oil rigs and bits like that, they need to be able to verify the exact trace of where all these different pieces come from. And they used to have 30, 40 different systems. What they've done is they've implemented an SSI system on top of that. So they've externalized all of that trust into an open decentralized thing. And that means that suddenly all of their systems talk the same language. They can verify at any point from any particular system, any point, anywhere in the whole chain in an accurate way. And what that means also is that before, where you had all these different separate integration points, data could be lost, data could be mistaken. But if it's all externalized, then it all sort of fits nicely. So yeah, we're not there just yet, but it's coming very, very soon. And I would say mass market adoption, I think you're looking at 3 to 5 years. I mentioned in Europe, for example, there's both at the kind of country level and also at the whole European Union level, initiatives talking about actually creating these SSI networks at the governmental level. So they're actually going to be fitted into government systems, because obviously from the public sector as well, they have this problem of these interoperability of trust between different systems.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. So you see maybe EMEA leading other regions? At
the moment, yeah, EMEA is definitely ahead of this. I think a lot of it is actually off the back of the GDPR and the data regulations, to be honest. In essence, the way that I see SSI, it's mostly around 2 concepts. It's about empowering users to have control over their own identity, but also over their own data. And because of that, and because in Europe we had the GDPR regulations, and it sort of came up in the public consciousness of actually maintaining your own data is really, really important. The likes of Facebook have all my data and sell it everywhere. Well, I want to actually have control over how we control that. And this is an important thing inside of Europe, so that's where they're leading, and that's where the funding is going. But also, off the back of the interest in blockchain and that kind of idea, it seems a natural progression of where we're going. Another area that is in part of this SSI stuff is what they call Web 3.0. You've probably all heard of decentralized finance and the ideas around that. And without SSI being in there as a trust layer and an identity layer, a lot of that doesn't work, and a lot of it is open to risk. And looking at it not from the consumer point of view, but if you actually look at it from the company point of view as well, you don't actually really want to maintain a massive database of your user data if you're providing a service, because then you're liable if you get hacked. That's all that data that you're going to leak. I think it was Wells Fargo, for example, leaking all that data everywhere. That's really, really bad. With SSI, you don't have that. All that data is contained at the user side. So not only do you have limited liability, but also when it comes to the cyber criminals looking to attack you, there's no point. There's no point in spending that energy to actually get into a system, because there's nothing for them to retrieve of any use.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Thank you, Joss. We're running up on time. So I would thank you again and turn it back to Margot and Steve.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a couple more questions, if you don't mind, Joss. With respect to owning and controlling the data, the subclaims, the ability to sort of slice and dice the data, will the data owner be able to slice their own claims? I'm not even sure how to exactly ask that question. So
Yeah.
let's just take the driver's license, right? You've got the address, you have the gender, you have age. And if you put that into 3 buckets in the wallet, you know, how does it come over? Does it come over as one and the data owner gets to slice and dice it, or?
Yeah, so yeah, that's an excellent question. The short answer is yes. The owner basically, in principle, once you've got that claim, you can chop it up however you like. Where this is interesting, or a sort of side, a way to think about this backwards, is that at the moment, if I actually have to fill in a form, a web form, and I have my name, address, etc., there could be a time, there aren't any standards around this yet, but there could be a time where, okay, well, I have a number of verifiable credentials that have proof of my name, proof of my address, etc. Protocol could be developed where they say, okay, rather than fill in this form, give me all this data and take it, that service can expose something and say, this is the data that I need. And the agent, so the software that's operating on the device, can look at my verifiable credentials and say, well, this one's got your age, this one's got your name, this one's got your address. Here is that packaged up in it's a credential. It's referred to as a verifiable presentation, but basically it's another verifiable credential with those pieces taken from those 3 separate sources. And so this is what I'm going to provide to them.
Yeah,
yes or
so
no.
I see, like an aggregator of data, agent, and then it fills it in the fields. That's sort of like automating. It's like creating, privacy, efficiency, and yeah, that's cool. And then with respect to the wallet, is that like unhosted or hosted? And how does, in terms of, you know, from a breach perspective, is it, you know, I have my leather wallet, okay, on my desk or somewhere in a drawer, and the only way that someone's going to get that, I suppose, aside from getting the numbers from a credit card database somewhere, but, you know, getting my actual wallet is to break into my house. So how talk a little bit about the digital wallets and how they're stored.
Yeah, so at the moment, digital wallets are primarily, as I say, pieces of software that tend to run on what they call, you know, trusted devices. So say, for example, I have a digital wallet on my phone, and that's where my digital wallet lives. And obviously, if that gets lost or stolen, then you would have access to the contents of the wallet. Generally, when a wallet is implemented on a device, obviously there's a layer of protection above that. So most of the time that's a biometric thing. If you think about the Apple Wallet is a good example.
Sure. So it's an access device regardless of where the data is.
Yeah, but the other interesting aspect of the SSI approach, though, is those credentials, because they're issued by a because they're issued by a trusted party, they can be revoked. In the same way that you can cancel your credit cards and things like that, VCs can also be revoked and expired. And in general, actually, the way to approach that is to have a shorter lifespan VC, because you can always request a new one. As you know, I can always request an updated version of my credential, but I can also cancel any time. I can also cancel any of my own credentials and any links to anybody else through that connection concept.
Okay. And last question is, you mentioned, I'm not sure I heard this right, but I'll ask it, that the attributes would be visible if you printed the document. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, so inside of our secure signing platform, we create a appearance on top of the signature that allows you to resolve those credentials.
Okay. There are some, that's interesting. There are some laws now that are requiring the paper record to be able to have, I'm not even sure the right wording, but attributes. So it's an electronic document that has now been reduced to a paper rendering, and it needs to have features, attributes associated with it to prove its, authenticity. So that sounds like perhaps what you're talking about is a way to solve for that requirement.
Absolutely, yeah. That's exactly how it would work, because ultimately, if you imagine a good example actually be a document that spans 5 pages, each of which has a signature on that page. And if I find the paper version of one of those pages, because of the way that SSI works, that entry on that page allows me to get back to the VC, lets me get back to the document, which means I can see the other credentials issued to that document at that time. And as I mentioned, one of those would be the thing that gives you the link basically back to the original digital copy of that particular document.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. Okay, well, thank you very, very much.
Okay.
All right, so just very quickly, because we're almost at the top of the hour. Thank you, Joss and Larry, that was great. Ezra has a robust public policy committee and meets regularly to discuss a number of issues, some of which are on this screen right in front of you. Over the years, there's been a concerted effort to try to advocate and educate on the use and acceptance of electronic signatures and records in many areas. Focus has been on electronic wills, acceptance of e-signed records to be filed with the IRS, obviously supporting blockchain initiatives with a technology neutrality focus. E-notary, which would include remote online notarization. We have a tech RON vendor caucus within Ezra that's spending an amazing amount of time and has had an amazing amount of success on having states enact RON legislation. The committee has also interacted with Federal Reserve banks and Federal Home Loan banks in terms of educating for the acceptance of e-notes as collateral in all the multiple regions. There's a very active working group for vehicle titling. And everyone in that group would love additional participation with respect to titling and e-odometer issues. So we're encouraging anybody who's listening to join Ezra, if you're not already a member, to participate in the public policy initiatives. And if you are an Ezra member, to continue to participate. So thank you all very much. Steve and I thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions about Ezra or about the education series, you can feel free to reach out to Steve or myself. You can find out more about Ezra by going to www.esignrecords.org. And we hope to have you join and or see you online at the next webinar. So thank you very much.